Back in the 60s, the music scene in Los Angeles spawned major bands from that era such as the Byrds, Love, and the Doors. The Music Machine was one of the most underrated groups to come out of that scene. Their dark rebellious image and untamed musical approach proved to be a major influence on punk bands from the 70s and beyond, and it was also an influence on bands from the Los Angeles scene such as the Doors. Let's take a look at the history of the band, and explore the singles they released during their brief but brilliant career.
There's that situation, and how it really stands. I'm out of circulation, I'm all but washed my hands.
The Music Machine released their first single in September 1966. The song was written by lead singer and band leader Sean Bonniwell, and it became the band's biggest hit, reaching number 15 according to Billboard and remaining in the charts for several weeks. In order to achieve a heavier effect, the band tuned their instruments from the typical E to E-flat, and despite the fact that the song clocked at 1 minute and 56 seconds, it compiled 4 distinctive rhythm changes. Oddly enough, Talk Talk was originally released as the B-side of the single. The A-side was another good song called Come On In.
Come on in. The water's fine.
The track predated the sort of sound that the Doors popularized later in 1967. Radio DJs, however, seemed to prefer the B-side, and the band made numerous appearances on television shows promoting the song. The band, with their black outfits and single black leather glove, caused quite an impression every time they appeared on television. Talk Talk became one of the quintessential garage rock tracks of the 60s. The band embarked on a national tour, and entered the studio in November 1966 to record their first LP. Turn on the Music Machine saw the band employing complex lyrical and instrumental arrangements that went beyond the typical garage group format. But Sean Bonniwell wasn't fully satisfied with the record. This was mainly due to the fact that his original material had to compete with cover versions chosen by the record label, who expected that well-known songs would increase record sales. One of the highlights of the record, however, was an excellent slow cover of Hey Joe, which bore a strong resemblance to Jimi Hendrix's later version.
Hey Joe, do you think you'll ever die?
The group released their second single in January 1967. Both sides of the single were taken from the band's debut album. The A-side, a song called People in Me, featured a great fuzz guitar riff and some truly unconventional lyrics.
When you see the people in me, my spirit, what will you do?
The B-side was another great song called Masculine Intuition.
I've got a masculine intuition whisper, keep coming on strong.
Unfortunately, the band's management angered radio executives for initially making the song exclusively available to a rival station, and as a result, the single suffered from inadequate airplay. The record stalled at number 66.
Los Angeles on $1 million weekend with me, baby. The real Don Steele. All those groovy golders for the reminiscing Fun Devils out there, huh?
During off periods in their hectic touring schedule, the band found time to record their third 45, which was released in April 1967. Once again, both sides of the single were written by Sean Bonniwell. One of the main differences between the Music Machine and many so-called garage bands from that era is that their songs were the product of intense rehearsal. The group was tighter than most bands from that period, and they were incredibly precise in execution. The group's recordings also benefited from a revolutionary 10-track tape system built by engineer Paul Buff. At a time when most other advanced studios were still struggling with 4 tracks, this system allowed the group to experiment and explore a different approach to sound. The B-side of the single was an excellent track called Absolutely Positively.
Absolutely positively, I want what I want.
Just like most of their 45s, the single achieved regional recognition, but it failed to reach the success of their first single. The Music Machine released their following single in September 1967.
Is anybody hungry? Oh, say I didn't ask. Eagle never hungers the fly. Listen and I'll tell you why.
The Eagle Never Hunts the Fly is regarded as one of the band's finest singles. It was a sonically compelling recording which sounded unlike anything else from that period. And once again, the lyrics tackled unconventional topics that were rarely found in songs from that period. In this case, the track dealt with the topic of government surveillance. The B-side was a mysterious-sounding song with a strangely dark psychedelic vibe. Unfortunately, shortly after the release of this single, the band broke up due to mismanagement and misappropriation of funds. The production deal that the band originally signed with producer Brian Ross stated that the Music Machine name was owned by the producer, who paid little to no royalties to the group. Sean Bonniwell successfully negotiated his recording contract with Original Sound be transferred to Warner Brothers, and he formed a new band with session musicians Ed Jones on bass, Harry Garfield on organ, Alan Wisdom on lead guitar, and Jerry Harris on drums. The group was renamed the Bonniwell Music Machine, and the band's first release was issued in November 1967. Bottom of the Soul was an excellent song with the sort of unusual structure that came to define many of Bonniwell's compositions. The B-side of the single still featured the original lineup of the Music Machine.
The moment was there, electric chemicals were filling the air. The tasty substance of emotional glue was at its best a hollow clue.
The track was originally recorded in May 1967, and it marked the last time that the original lineup of the group recorded together in the studio. The song reflected Bonniwell's fascination with mysticism and metaphysics. The Bonniwell Music Machine issued their second single in January 1968. The B-side of the single was a song called Soul Love, which seemed to merge soul music with some unusual psychedelic touches.
We don't need it anyhow. All we need is you and I. We got soul love.
Just a month after the release of this single, the group released their debut album. The record featured songs recorded by the new lineup of the band, plus 6 tracks taken from the last recording session by the original lineup of the group. The album saw Bonniwell branching out from the psych and proto-punk sound of the Music Machine's earlier recordings into a more eclectic direction. Unfortunately, the album went pretty much unnoticed, and it failed to reach the Billboard 200. Bonniwell assembled a third incarnation of the band and released a new single in May 1968.
Then she brought me to the light, making everything alright, changing the night into day, yeah. She brought me.
The A-side was a rather mediocre song that seemed to lack direction. The highlight of the single was the B-side.
You love me again, you love me again. I'm telling you ahead of time, I'm positive you'll change your mind.
One of the best songs that Bonniwell recorded during that period was a track called Dark White, which remained unreleased until 1984, when it was featured on a compilation issued by Rhino Records.
I need you tonight. I know you're dark white, but I've got to have you anyhow.
Sadly, instead of releasing Dark White as a single, the Music Machine released a very average 45 in September 1968.
Can't you hear the wind outside your window? Whisper.
Both sides of the single were quite mediocre and forgettable. The group's final single was distributed on Bell Records and released in March 1969.
And we no longer know when to stop and when to go.
This was a much better single than the previous effort. The B-side was an ecological protest song called Mother Nature, Father Earth.
She cries, children please, while the trees are disappearing.
Once again, however, the single meant nothing in the charts. Disenchanted by the music industry and his lack of success, Bonniwell gave up the rights to the band's name, and signed on to Capitol Records as a solo artist. Bonniwell released a solo album called Close, which offered a total departure from the proto-punk and psych sound of the Music Machine.
He's never seen the skies, never complains.
The record saw Bonniwell blending folk rock and orchestrated influence, and embracing a more poetic approach.
Something every man must face as his child begins to grow.
Sean Bonniwell left the music business after the release of the album, and the Music Machine remained largely forgotten until their music experienced a revival of interest in the 1980s. This interest already began in 1973 when Talk Talk was featured on the Essential Nuggets compilation, but it exploded in the 80s when several labels started issuing psych and garage compilations featuring forgotten singles from the 60s. The appearance of revival garage bands such as the Chesterfield Kings or the Fuzztones, among many others, also contributed to this renewed interest in psych and garage bands from the mid to late 60s. And the release of several Music Machine compilations over the years prompted music fans to rediscover their music and give the group the recognition they deserve.